Going. We have our panelists and co-hosts here, and our colleagues from friends and colleagues from Texas A&M University. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. This webinar is organized by the Centers of International Business Education at Michigan State and Texas A&M Universities as part of our Research Spotlight series. The topic of today's webinar is Fuzzy Set Qualitative Comparative Analysis as a Research Tool in International Business. For this webinar, we invited two IB scholars who will discuss their perspectives on the opportunities available for high-impact IB research using FSQCA. This webinar will include short presentations followed by a discussion moderated by the co-hosts. David Griffith and I will be your co-hosts today. David is the Halle van der Heider Chair in Business, Professor of Marketing, and Associate Director of Research at the Center for International Business Studies at Texas A&M University. I'm Ahmet Kırca. I'm an Associate Professor of International Business and Marketing at Michigan State, Broad College. I also serve as the Director of International Business Center, MSU Cyber at MSU. I'm delighted and honored to present you our esteemed panelists today. First, I would like to thank you, and I would like to thank our panelists for agreeing to join us for today's webinar. And I would also like to thank you for participating, for joining us for this webinar. Our first speaker is Krista Levelin. Krista is joining us from Florida Southern College, where she serves as an associate professor and MBA program director. Before joining FSC, she was a faculty member at University of Wyoming's College of Business. Krista has published several articles in SMJ, Business and Society, Org Studies, Journal of World Business, International Business Review, among others. Our next panelist is Professor Stav Feinschmidt. Stav is an associate professor in the Department of International Business at Florida International University. His research focuses on the institutional and governance context surrounding multinational companies and the ways in which organizations develop and deploy capabilities. Stav is a prolific scholar who has published in leading international business and management journals, including ASQ, JIBS, Journal of World Business, SMJ, and Journal of Management Studies, among others. Now I will pass the proverbial microphone back to David, who will lead the discussion during this panel. Enjoy.
Howdy, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Just a few housekeeping matters. Please feel free to add any questions within the Q&A or the chat. I will be fielding questions. I'll stop our speakers if we have a direct clarification question. Otherwise, I hold the questions to the end of the presentations, and we engage in an open Q&A. All right. Without anything else to say, let me turn the field over to Krista.
Actually, Stav is going to start, so I'm going to pass it over.
No.
You said to be provocative.
All right, so Stav, let's start.
All right, and I'm going to pass the mic to somebody else. No, I'm just kidding. All right, that's it. I'm taking the mic. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank David and Ahmed for organizing this, and of course the cyber team for the logistics. We also have a fiber here at FIU, and it's always fun to do these kinds of cross collaborations between universities and between cyber. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here, see some friends, some friendly faces, and also talk about ways in which we can move international business forward. In terms of just the kind of agenda, we have a very loose agenda because we do want to keep it as informal as possible. But our loose agenda is I'll go first and just cover some of the basics of FSQCA. I presume some in the audience have seen FSQCA before, heard about it, but just to make sure we kind of have some of these foundations in place, including an example from a GIBS study of how it was used, and then pass it over to Krista, who will talk about some of the several ways in which FSQCA can be quite useful in international business, and then also show us how in prior studies that are either comparative or IB kind of cross-border per se, where FSQCA was used to sort of break new ground in our understanding of a particular phenomenon. So I hope that works for everybody, and I'm just going to take a second to share my slides. Okay, so just to confirm, can you see my slides?
We're in
Yep.
presentation mode.
Awesome. Very good. Okay, so let's cover some of the basics.
Stav,
Yeah.
you're in presentation mode, which means we can see sort of the next slide as well as the main slide. There you go.
Now?
Perfect.
Okay, good. Okay, so what is FSQCA, or how is it qualitative comparative analysis? Actually, FSQCA is an analytical technique, which is kind of the technique we use when we take a neo-configurational approach. Configurational approaches in IB or in management more broadly are not entirely new. We had research with a kind of configurational approach to it. I can, just as an example, I can think of the miles and snow typology and so on. So configurational thinking is not entirely new. But I think what has happened in the last, I don't know, maybe 15 years or so, particularly with the work of Per Fist, is kind of this emergence of the neo-configurational perspective in management and IB research, and shares some of the fundamental components with the older configurational research, but also brings in some new developments, particularly coming, I think, from areas like political science and so on, where these things have been popular for a while. So the major underlying premise in neo-configurational research is that causation or causality is complex. It's not a straightforward phenomena. In particular, the kind of overarching questions that are asked when taking the neo-configurational perspective are what configurations of attributes are associated with an outcome of interest. So as you can see, the underlying premise here is that outcomes of interest to us are not often caused or brought about by a single factor, and they're brought by several factors that come together in distinct ways to bring about the outcome. And that is kind of a direct result of the fact that we're dealing with social sciences, right? And things are complicated, and there's usually a complex explanation for things. In the neo-configurational perspective, cases or observations are viewed as set theoretic configurations of conditions. So a key aspect of the neo-configurational perspective and FSQCA, its analytical tool, is that we're no longer operating on variables. We're operating on sets or conditions. So as an example, temperature is a variable, but fever is a condition where you use the information in your temperature variable to determine whether a given patient has fever, right? So there's this kind of fundamental shift in thinking from variance-based approaches to understanding phenomenon to set theoretic thinking. The former is rooted in linear algebra, whereas the latter is rooted in Boolean algebra. Now, once we shift from variables to sets, or conditions. And then the cases in data can be members of different sets and to different degrees, right? Now we can actually evaluate types of relationships between causal conditions and outcomes that we couldn't do with linear algebra or variance-based approaches. For example, necessity and sufficiency. Is membership in a particular condition necessary for the outcome to occur? Is membership in a particular condition or set of conditions sufficient to bring about the outcome? So unlike the kind of net effects thinking that we're used to in variance-based approaches, where we're really after the unique contribution of individual explanatory factors, with the new configurational approach and FSQCA, what we're looking for is not this net effects thinking of a particular variable kind of in a battle to explain variance with other variables. What we're actually asking is, how does a particular condition combine with other conditions to bring about the outcome? So that means that there are certain fundamental elements to this approach that we need to explicitly state so that we understand what that approach looks like. So the first one is conjunctural causation, which means that causation or outcomes are caused by the ways in which conditions work together, that they come together to bring about that outcome, which means that the underlying kind of premise of conjunctural causation is complementarity, that things work together in complementary ways to bring about the outcome. Now, you might ask me, okay, but I can do interactions with regression analysis, right? That is true. And you might be able to identify some complementarities with interaction or moderation effects. But really, after interacting two variables, three at most, you kind of run out of your ability to cogently explain interaction effects. I think I saw in a particular study that once you have four-way interactions, then it just becomes essentially unexplainable. And so here, what we're talking about is complementary, sometimes between two conditions, but sometimes between six conditions, right? And so because they don't really compete to explain variance, the approach of seeing how they combine in complementary or synergistic ways is much more tenable. The second element is equifinality. And that means that I can take the same set of conditions and I can combine them in different ways to achieve the same outcome. If my outcome is a delicious carrot cake, I can take 6 ingredients and I can combine them in different ways. Where in one recipe, maybe I'm using only 4 out of the 6. In another recipe, I'm using 5 out of the 6. And I can use them in different ways. Sometimes one ingredient is present in the recipe. Sometimes an ingredient is absent in the recipe. And nonetheless, I am able to construct a delicious carrot cake. This leads to this kind of known characteristic of equifinality, that there are several pathways to reach the same outcome. And these kinds of different pathways are very difficult to discern with variance-based approaches. Now, a kind of derivative of that is that if we have multiple pathways to reach a particular outcome, it means that there could be substitution between elements among these pathways. So if I take a certain pathway and I take an ingredient out, but I put 2 other ingredients in that did not even exist in that pathway, I might also be able to get to the outcome. So then we have these substitution relationships between the different recipes. And finally, the third element is causal asymmetry, which means that those recipes that lead to the outcome that I'm interested in, the opposite of those recipes might not necessarily lead to the absence of the outcome that I'm looking into. which creates this kind of asymmetry in the configurations that lead to the outcome versus the configurations that lead to the absence of the outcome, right? Let us kind of see how it works in an example.
Can I just
Yes,
ask a quick clarification question?
Yes.
So I know FIS talks about the equifinality and all the other elements, but there's also a reference to the linearity assumption in everything that we do, or even the curvilinearity, right? The fact that variable or variance-based approaches assume that the impact of a variable is exactly the same across the entire curve. If this is a linear curve, fine, right? It's always one is one, one is one. So there's in perfect collinearity, it's one, right? It's if you add one to the variable, then you get one in the outcome too. If you change that, lower correlations and curvilinearity arguments certainly address some of those concerns, but still linear. The effect of one variable on the other is diminishing but linear. And in the spirit of being a little bit controversial, because that's something that David and I always like to do in these webinars, and that's something I told to my doctoral students, because we're talking about philosophy of science, causality issues, and so on and so forth. Can you give us some insights about this basic assumption of all these econometric models pertaining to linearity and how FSQCA, well, flies in the face of all these linearity assumptions? Or am I wrong interpreting all of this and just being too controversial?
No, I don't think it's controversial at all. The entire concept of linearity comes from the fact that you are working with a variance-based approach, right? And so then linearity is actually something that makes sense. But when you are working with Boolean algebra, right, essentially with Venn diagrams, right, then the concept of linearity does not make sense, because we are actually not even asking what happens to the outcome when the independent variable in regression terms changes. This is simply in the world of Boolean algebra and set theoretical relations, this is not a kind of a sensical way or a question that could be answered. And for that reason, it's important, and we always say that FSQCA is not better than an econometric or variance-based approach. It is just a completely different approach to examining relationships between constructs or phenomena in social science, right? So, for example, going back to my previous discussion about temperature and fever, right? So if I take the variable temperature, I can actually create many different sets or conditions from that variable. For instance, fever, high fever, not high fever, not low or high temperature. So I can extract from that variable all kinds of different conditions. A condition is essentially this kind of creation of a Venn diagram, if you can kind of envision it, where the observations in your data are either members, or they're inside the circle or outside the circle, right? Now, you can also have gradation, right? You can also have degrees. How much in the circle are you, or how much outside of the circle are you? But then once you kind of shift to that thinking in terms of conditions and sets rather than variables, so then the questions that you're asking are entirely different, right? If I have conditions and sets, I'm no longer answering the question of how much on average change in Y you get when X changes by 1 unit or something like that, right? This is essentially almost a nonsensical question in the context of sets, right? The questions are, if you are a member of a set that I have defined, right, or a condition that I have defined, how does that relate to your membership in an outcome condition that I have defined? Is it necessary to be part of that causal set to also be a member of the outcome condition? Is it sufficient once you're part of that set? we also observe that you're a part of the other set. Do you need to be part of that set and also be a member of two other sets in order for you to be member of the outcome set, right? So really these kinds of questions that are linearity related are really not part of this way of examining relationship, right? So it is simply different. It is not better or worse than econometric approaches. It is simply entirely different. So we can see in this example, this is a paper from JIVS by Donald Creeley, and you know, kind of, I would say one of the pioneering papers, especially in IB, bringing the configurational approach or an NFSQCA in particular into the IB community. And what Creeley was interested in with this paper is explaining why some foreign subsidiaries have a broad stakeholder orientation in the host country, while other subsidiaries take a narrow stakeholder approach in the host country. And the kind of underlying premise here is that there will be certain combinations of local and global conditions or factors that will together explain why a subsidiary might have a broad or narrow stakeholder orientation. In here in this table, the way to interpret this is that when you see a filled circle, it means that a particular condition is present. And when you see a crossed circle, it means that a particular condition is absent. If you see an empty space where a condition could be, it means that this condition doesn't matter. It can be present or absent. And this is one of the, in my opinion, kind of the biggest advantages of FSQCA. So let us see what is going on here. So if we look at configuration number one, the way to interpret this configuration, is that subsidiaries that are R&D intense and that operate in a context that is a developed host country where there's a strong government influence, and they also belong to a parent multinational company that has a lot of global revenue. So it's a large multinational company. They will tend to exhibit a broad stakeholder orientation, right? So it's kind of the recipe, right? The broad stakeholder orientation is a delicious carrot cake, and then the R&D intensity, government influence, developed host country, and global revenue are the ingredients that you have to mix in together in order to get that broad stakeholder orientation by the subsidiary. And in this configuration of conditions, as defined by the author, right? So the author in the paper explains how he defined membership in the R&D intensity set, right? So the data is actually R&D intensity, right? We're familiar with that variable. It's typically some kind of ratio, right? But then based on that ratio, then the author defines, okay, I will define that, you know, when you reach a certain level of R&D intensity, you become a member of the R&D intense subsidiary set, okay? And then you can have different degrees of being a member of that set. But nonetheless, you can define at what point a subsidiary is in or out of the set of R&D intense subsidiaries, and then the degree of membership. And you can see in this configuration that first principle, conjunctural causation, right? And complementarity, in that a broad stakeholder orientation is caused here by this conjunctural causation between 4 different ingredients or 4 different conditions, meaning that they are complementary in bringing about a broad stakeholder orientation. But then you also see that there are 5 other recipes or configurations that can give you a broad stakeholder orientation, and they are quite different from the first configuration. And this is the second principle of equifinality, that there are multiple roads to get to Rome, right? And once you have more than one road to get to Rome, you can also see that there are substitutions. So if I take configuration 1 and I take out government influence and I take out global revenue and instead I put Slack, I also get to Rome. Meaning that in this context, Slack can substitute or be a functional substitute for global revenue, government influence. If you're wondering why some circles are big and some circles are small, there is some technical explanation for this, which we can get into at the end if we have time. But for now, you can ignore that. And finally, if you look at the configurations for a narrow stakeholder orientation, you can see that they are not quite a mirror image of the configurations that lead to a broad stakeholder orientation. So this is the third principle of causal asymmetry, that the conditions or the configurations that lead you to the outcome that you're interested in, their reverse, their mirror image, does not necessarily lead you to the absence of that outcome. So if I take configuration 1 and I kind of flip those 4 conditions such that those 4 conditions are absent, instead they're present, I'm not necessarily going to get a narrow stakeholder orientation. So this is just to kind of lay out some of the basic principles and show you what that looks like in an actual paper. And now I'll pass it on to Krista to just talk a little bit about kind of broadly how IB research can benefit, or why IB research can benefit from such an approach, and then give you a few more practical examples of what that looks like.
All right, thank you, Stav. Before I start, I'm going to answer. There was a question in the Q&A and about the actual software that we use for FSQCA. And actually, in the 2 examples that I'm going to talk about, Stav and one of Stav's papers and one of mine, we both used the FSQCA 3.1 software, which I can probably get you the link before we're done, but you can Google it and you can download it for free. And that's how I think Stav and I both started with FSQCA. And there's a great Charles Reagan, who created this software. There's a great manual that walks you through how to use the technique. You can also use there's code available in R, and some scholars use Stata. But again, all of those are available. And we can talk more at the end, but I'll jump into what I plan to talk about. All right, so I'm going to try to summarize and build on some of the key points that Stav made, and that unique features that are associated with a configurational approach using FSQCA. And ultimately, it's these unique features that really allow us to have this deeper engagement with the complexity of IB phenomena. And I'm going to try to touch on each of these different points that are here by using some examples. And so the first study is by my friend Stav, and along with Michael Witt and Ruth Aguilera, and this was published in ASQ in 2022. And so in this study, they're investigating how national institutional contexts and organizational conditions combine in configurations to lead a sample of banks from 32 OECD countries to either over-conform or under-conform to a global norm associated with board independence. And so they're looking for this holistic understanding of what drives nonconformity, both over and under, and they're recognizing that these national and organizational conditions are interconnected. And so this kind of provides the first justification for why QCA is probably going to be an appropriate technique. And that's really important. The research question objective, it needs to be configurational in nature, because if it isn't, then you're probably better off with a regression type model, correlation based. And then they also provide justification for this configurational approach with FSQCA through their theoretical framing. So, which is directly related to this choice of conditions. Because with FSQCA, unlike a regression model, you don't throw in a whole bunch of control variables. The concept of control variables isn't really relevant. So every time you add a condition, it increases the possible number of configurations exponentially. So the choice of what you're going to include in your configuration or your analysis really needs to be driven by by theory, why they're there, but also that they're going to be interconnected. And that's again something that really highlights the difference with a QCA analysis sometimes to some of the more conventional. So what they do is they draw on the idea that corporate governance structures or board composition, it results from political processes and power differentials between certain actors that have influence over the appointment of directors to boards. And it's the idea that this institutional context shapes whether these actors, managers, shareholders, or labor are the key drivers of, whether the firm has, overconforms or underconforms to board independence. And so we have these three national level conditions: shareholder rights, managerial discretion, and labor rights. But then they also argue that there's going to be organizational conditions that are either going to enhance or maybe diminish the extent to which these, these groupings or these three actors are able to influence and drive board composition decisions. And so they've made a really strong case in this paper. It's pages and pages, and I'm giving a real brief summary, but they've really made the case in this paper of why this phenomenon is configurational in nature. And that, again, has to do with the fact that these conditions are related, that they're going to be interdependent and interconnected. And as you see, this is a complex phenomenon. It's multi-level, like so many of our research questions in IB are. And so we can capture this complexity, these complementarities, these synergies, within a level, between the managerial discretion, labor rights, shareholder rights, but we can also capture it, between the different levels. And so, again, in the paper, they make a really good case for, why this should be studied with FSQCA in a configurational manner. And so we see from the results here in Table 6 that we have equifinality. We have different configurations that have the absence and presence of different conditions leading to the same outcome. And I just want to touch a little bit on, again, this is kind of a technical thing, but you see this, value coverage, solution coverage of 0.55. And so what that means is that these configurations account for 55% of the instances of overconformity within this sample of firms. And then the consistency value of 0.94, what that means is that 94% of these individual cases or the observations that are in these configurations, they exhibit overconformity. So these are kind of the, I guess it would kind of be like the model fit numbers, but consistency and coverage are two parameters that, are important when you're doing FSQCA. And so something else that I want to point out about this study before I get to the interpretation. So if you can leave this slide, that's fine. But it's something that's really kind of cool about this study, and I think it's going to be really helpful to those of us that use QCA a lot in their research, is that this was a longitudinal sample. It covered 4 years of data, And often, if you're reading FSQCA papers, a limitation that authors will talk about is that, capturing some of the temporal effects with longitudinal data, can be problematic with QCA. But in this study, what they do is, and others have done this, they pool the data. So they have their 4 years of data pooled. And again, there's lots of published studies that have done that. But what they also do is they go in and they run the analysis for each individual year. And then what they report for the pooled, the analysis on the pooled data, they only include the configurations that were also consistent through at least 3 of the 4 years. And that's a really interesting way to improve the rigor that's associated with using this type of sample. So I just wanted to note that, because that's kind of I think you're going to get cited a lot for that stuff. I mean, I've already cited you for it. So, all right. So another thing I want to say, the actual analysis, again, going back to the start when I started talking about what's the software we can use. Honestly, running the analysis in many ways isn't all that complicated. What's complicated is once you have all these configurations, once you have these results, how do you make sense of them? How do you interpret them? And the examples that, if I have time for the second example, but this paper and the other one I was going to talk about, it really focuses on it takes an abductive approach. So, it chooses the conditions based on theory and why they're going to be expected to combine. But then with the results, we want to look at the patterns that we see within the configurations and across the configurations. And Stav talked a little bit about that with the Crilly paper, talking about this idea of functional substitutes. So in this paper that we're talking about, they took the approach of, looking at what was similar across configurations and then going back to their theory. And that's when you can really start to get at some of these things like we see on this slide, the potential underlying driver. So in these, Stav, would you mind going back to the previous slide just so I can see the configurations? Yeah. So if we look at these 3 here, O1, O2A, and O2B, we see that they all have the presence of managerial discretion. They have a lack of ownership concentration and a lack of foreign shareholdings. And then where there's blanks, that means that the condition may be present or absent. And so we see, for instance, in if we look at like CEO duality, that's absent in O1 and O2A, but it can be either or in O2B. And we see that for several of the conditions. So, we talk about, what's absent, what's present, but then how do we interpret the fact that this recipe came about, that it's, consistently sufficient for this outcome? And as I said, Stav and Michael and Ruth, they go back to their theoretical perspective and they talk about what, from that political perspective, what's driving this overconformity to board independence norms. And so now you can go to the next slide, Stav, thanks. And so
just a quick clarification.
Yeah, go ahead.
So when you say consistently sufficient across time, is there a statistics for that, or is this an observational assessment?
It has to do with the analysis that we use to identify these configurations based on Boolean algebra and a truth table is called the sufficiency analysis. And then there is a consistency threshold. So and best practice says use at least 0.80 as your consistency threshold. So what that means is that these configurations, when the analysis was run, all achieved, and again, I don't remember for sure, because a lot of times people use a higher consistency threshold than 0.8, and they may have in this paper, but it means that it met that threshold. And again, the sufficient part of it is that that's what this analysis is providing.
Yeah. So my question is about the observations across time. So the configurations across time, do you have a statistic? Because I know within each period, you use that consistency statistic,
Mhm.
but do you have something for across time?
Well, go ahead. I was going to say the fact that it's identified to
Yeah.
me, but go ahead, Stav, if you have it's your paper.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's not the only paper that actually has multiple observations per subject, or that does anything that has a temporal component to it. I'll answer this in two parts. The first part is that the word statistic does not belong in the world of set theoretic analysis, because nobody is inferring anything from the analysis to a population of any kind. So it is not an inferential approach, right? And for that reason, the terms necessary and sufficient are essentially kind of jargon that should be taken only in the context of what it means as defined for this analytical technique. It is not to be used in the literal sense of what the words mean in the English language, right? So we are not saying that, listen, if you have these conditions that you see here, the 3 or 4 things, you will always, that's it, you get the outcome, that's sufficient. You don't ever need anything else, right? So it does not literally mean that. It means within the confines of what is done in the study. The second thing I would mention is that there are quantitative ways of assessing this kind of consistency when you have panel data, right? When you have a temporal component, there are ways that are quantitative. They are not necessarily inferential. There's no p-value. That does not exist in set theoretic analysis. I mean, it exists if you take some stuff with this and then we do some statistical tests as kind of outside of the realm of what happens here. But the answer is yes and no. There are quantitative ways to look at what happens over time, but they are not inferential in the way that we understand them in linear algebra terms.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Okay, you can go to the next slide. I'll just quickly sum this up. So again, you run the analysis, and then the interpretation of these configurations, they label, and I do want to just mention the 2A and 2B, O2A and O2B. Those subscripts refer to the fact that those two configurations had the same core conditions. And so we call those, or Pierre Fisk labeled them as neutral permutations. And so we typically give those subscripts when they have the same core conditions. Now, most FSQCA studies, or at least the ones I'm mostly familiar with, when interpreting the configurations, as was done in this paper, we don't differentiate between core and peripheral, because again, the peripheral, they're impacting the way that the effects that the core have on the outcome. So we use all the conditions in the interpretation. And so you can see here, based on the results for those 3 configurations, and going back to what was argued, at the front end of the paper about why these conditions, can be associated with, overconformity or underconformity, why there's, what's going to shape the power differentials between these different actors. That's what drives the pattern that is listed here, as well as the potential underlying driver. And so this is, one way that we see FSQCA being interpreted. There's other ways. I'm not sure that we're getting close to time, so I may skip the next example and just kind of go to my last slide.
We're okay on time if you'd like to continue on the examples. I think the examples are really helpful for clarifying its use.
Okay. All right. Well, never mind. Stop. Go back to, okay. All right. So this one there. Thanks. So the other study I was going to just highlight, and again, I'm going to highlight some different features There will be some overlap on what I highlighted with the previous, but there's some different things I want to highlight also. And so this is, doing self-promotion here. So this is a paper that I recently had accepted with co-author Maureen Muller-Kale at Business and Society. And we're looking at, what different configurations of board resource provisioning conditions help drive firms to either be leaders when it comes to ESG performance or laggards, so high versus low performance. And we wanted to, it's kind of the flip side of the previous paper, because when it comes to looking at the the contextual specificities, we're looking at how the institutional context might shape the effectiveness of these different governance or board bundles, whereas in the other paper, the boundary conditions were really represented by the organizational level. But again, it's a multi-level paper, multi-level analysis that FSQCA is really good at handling in most cases. So in this, this we're doing a similar type of interpretation, in that we're trying to look at patterns within the configurations and across, and then going back to our overarching theory, which was resource dependence theory, and the resources that boards represent. All the different directors together represent a board with different types of resource portfolios. And so, for instance, configurations 1, 2A, and 2B, we refer to those as, resource abundant boards. And then we talk about how within different institutional contexts, this type of board can be equally, it can be effective in lots of different institutional contexts because of the diversity that these board members bring, the resources that they bring. And we focus on, we use, for our institutional conditions, we're drawing from Scott's 3 pillars. And, we talk about and there's a broad comparative, institutional literature that talks about complementarities between different institutional conditions. And then we try to take that and also, fit it into how together with that organizational level drives these outcomes. And if you could just go to the next, skip the next slide. Yeah, and go to the next one. Because I didn't, oh, sorry, one after that. Guess I ordered them differently. Did I not have the inverse? Okay, yes, thank you. So when I talked about the Stav's ASQ paper, I didn't show the results for the underconformity. And that's, the other part of it. They talk about overconformity and then underconformity, which is kind of the inverse of overconformity. So in this paper, we look at the patterns for firms that are achieving, outstanding. They're in the set of high ESG performance. And then we look at the inverse for those board types that, aren't achieving that. And so I just wanted to highlight here that concept of causal asymmetry. So we can see here that, boards that are large, having a lot of directors on their boards, that's present in 2 of these configurations, but we also have the condition where the board is very small. We have, conditions that are present, that are part of the configuration leading to low, that are also part of the configurations leading to high. So it's just that concept of causal asymmetry. And I think that was, I guess one other thing I would stress back on the one that showed those resource-rich boards, we talk a lot in the paper about the complementarities that exist between having a large board, having lots of non-executive directors, having directors that are connected to other companies through directorships on other boards, and having a lot of female directors. And we talk about the fact how they all work together, as opposed to if we were looking at the net effects. There's been a lot of research that looks at the impact of having more women on the board. And we argue that when you're looking at just that net effect, you're holding everything else constant. And in reality, this board, we don't have constant conditions for these others. They're all changing at the same time. And so that's part of our justification for why we think that this board, these board conditions should be considered as a bundle. And now you can go to the last slide. And then we'll get in and answer all these great questions I see coming through. So the two examples that I kind of talked about took a similar approach to interpreting the findings after we identify the configurations. But there's examples of, there's other ways to present your interpretation of the findings. So a lot of papers that are using FSQCA and IB will, as opposed to labeling the configuration, or, they're still trying to get at that underlying mechanism that's based on the patterns, but a lot of times they'll put forth post hoc propositions. So again, kind of that abductive approach. But there's also, several researchers that are using FSQCA that take more of a deductive approach and actually put forth hypotheses, but notice I put configurational hypotheses. And so they're putting forth theory-based predictions that are really focused on the idea that it's going to be combination of conditions, or that certain ways that conditions combine will be sufficient for causing the outcome, and so on. And that was pretty much what I planned to say. I don't know if Stav has anything he wants to add, being especially familiar with that first paper.
Well, I don't know how much time we have, but I think we do have quite a few good questions coming in. So maybe we can start with those.
That'd be good.
Excellent, excellent. First off, thank you so much. What wonderful presentation, so informative. And we do have a lot of questions. So I'm going to ask the one that came in that kind of directly addresses the slide that's being shared, which is whether or not you could kindly clarify whether the methodology is a theory building approach or a theory testing approach. Who'd like to take that? Stav, Krista?
Both. It can be used in both ways. And that's kind of what I was trying to, I didn't talk very much about this slide, but, the paper, the AMJ paper by, Bell et al. And the Gibbs paper shown here, they're taking more of what I would say a theory testing and extension, because they're they're putting forth hypotheses, but they're combining, different predicted relationships, so that it really needs to be tested, that prediction, by a configurational method such as QCA. And whereas the other ones, especially the two examples I was talking about, yes, I mean, it's building on previous theory, but we're trying to provide new insights, something that's different, unconventional from the normal patterns that we've seen in the past. So Stav, you can probably elaborate a little bit on that.
I mean, it can do both exactly in the same way that any other method can do both. The software doesn't know if you came with a hypothesis or not, right? The software only knows what conditions are causal and what's the outcome condition, what the parameters. It will, do its Boolean minimization and all the kind of process, and it will tell you what configurations of the conditions that you have specified are associated with the outcome that you have specified. Now, if you come in with a certain expectation of what configurations would, should be associated with the outcome, the software doesn't know. So you can take a deductive approach, and you can take a more inductive approach. The cool thing about this is a little bit different, is that even if you come with a certain expectation that, look, I think that, there will be, that these configurations will be associated with the outcome, you might see those three configurations in the results, but you might see a fourth configuration that you did not expect. So in that way, doing this, doing FSQCA will always have a potentially inductive component. So because a configuration might be there that you did not expect, right? Whereas with a regression analysis, you can have an expectation for a particular variable or not. Maybe you're doing something exploratory, right? But the software isn't going to tell you, listen, there's other 4 variables that maybe you didn't consider, or ways in which they could interact with each other that might also explain the outcome. So do what you want with it, kind of thing, right? So that's kind of a cool thing about FSQCA.
So we have 2 questions in the chat that are kind of similar, but they're different. They're different. So I want to handle them differently. So the first one is, I am still not clear about configural approach. Most of the time, the independent variables are independent and interrelated, even in a variances-based approach. So when should we use FSQCA or regression for our research?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, that's correct. When you have variables, they tend to be correlated to different degrees. Sometimes it's trivial, sometimes it's not. But I think the main difference here in the type of interdependency, in the sense that when you're doing a econometric analysis, a variance-based approach, the variables compete to explain variance in the outcome. Whereas with FSQCA, there is no competition. Whether membership in a particular causal condition is associated with membership in the outcome that I'm interested in, right? May or may not require that this condition be combined with others, but that association itself between that condition and that outcome is not determined or could be altered by the associations of other causal conditions with the outcome itself. There is no competition to explain the same variance in the outcome. So that's kind of on the technical side. Bigger picture, when should I use configurational approach and when should I use a more traditional linear regression-based approach, really depends on your research question and the phenomena you're studying and the kind of theoretical perspective that you take on an issue, right? So some research questions inherently lend themselves to a configurational examination. Some do not. Sometimes the nature of your theoretical arguments suggests that there is a need to examine how things combine. That examining whether one unit change in X is going to result in some unit change in Y simply does not answer the question, right? So I think at a very fundamental level, it all goes back to what is your research question? What are you trying to understand?
That will lead me then to the next question, because I think it does hit to the issue of what your research question is, and to an extent, your prediction, right? Since there are many configurations that can lead to the same outcome, can we infer that these configurations are exhaustive, i.e., there are no other configurations that can lead to the same outcome? I would think not, in which case, does this not become a basic limitation of the methodology?
Krista, you want to take this one?
Well, I'll start. That's what coverage helps with, the parameter of coverage. And first off, you are right. These are not, especially when you have larger N samples like we showed in these 2 studies, the configurations, no, they are not covering all of the cases. And that's why the parameter of coverage is something that you want to take into consideration. And there aren't necessarily minimums for coverage, but the higher, and it can depend on your sample size too. That was my first thought, Stav. What else do you have?
I would say that the configurations are yes and no. They are exhaustive in the sense that these are the configurations that we are able to identify with the causal conditions that we have and with the data that we have on hand. There's also an ability for QCA to accommodate counterfactuals of what if we had data where some parts of these configurations are actually absent instead of present. But by and large, I would say if you're asking kind of, okay, big picture, if I identify a set of configurations in a study, can I conclude that in reality, this outcome that I'm interested in as a social science phenomena, that there are no other configurations of conditions that maybe I don't even have in my study that could lead to this outcome? The answer is, of course not, right? You are bound by the data that you have, the conditions that you have, the sample that you have, and so on. So in that sense, FSQCA is no different from regression analysis, right? There could be other variables, other samples, other contexts. So if you're asking in that sense, the answer is no. It is not exhaustive. Even if your coverage is high, right? Because you might be able to cover that outcome very well for your study, for that sample, for those causal conditions, and so on, not necessarily outside.
And one thing I would add is this was something I did. It's a QCA paper in Journal of Management, and I did a diversity analysis as kind of a robustness and looked at the other configurations that had low consistency, but that appeared quite frequently. And this was a suggested technique from, I think, Greg Kamer et al. 2008. They talk about best practices and with this technique. And that helped us actually reconfirm some of the patterns that we were putting forth in this study. Because there were other configurations that supported some of the underlying mechanisms, but didn't show up in our reported analysis because they had a consistency of 0.7 or something like that.
Yeah. So I just remembered that the answer was, is this a basic limitation of the technique? And I would say yes, it is a basic limitation of this technique, in the same way that this could be a basic limitation of an OLS regression or any kind of other regression, just simply not being able to have every variable that could be relevant. But it is important to know that if you are reading a paper that uses FSQCA or doing this analysis yourself, that the jargon that we use to describe the results and so on should not be interpreted literally based on the meaning of these words in the English language, but more so within the right. So like necessity, sufficiency, coverage, and so on, even causality, right? When we say causal conditions, there's nothing about FSQCA that somehow makes it better able to discern causality per se than a variance-based approach. It is also essentially showing you associations.
Excellent. Okay, I'm going to jump to a question in the Q&A. Does this approach enable researchers to get population-level inference? The results might be significantly affected by the sample set. It is the same in regression analysis, such that statistical analysis relies on the statistical property and set of tests to examine it, as well as employing a rich set of control variables. And then adding to this, can you share the practice of the sampling procedure when using FSQCA?
Okay.
There's a lot there. So you go ahead.
Lot to unpack.
Well, let's. So the first part was, can you infer to the population, which goes back to something that I said that I don't know, a few minutes ago or something like that. Not in the same way that we do with econometric or regression-based approaches, right? So FSQCA is not an inferential technique. It's based on set theory. It's based on set theoretical relations. It was not designed to make inferences to the population. Now, if you have the entire population and you conduct a configurational study on it, then you might actually see what's there to see about this population, right? At the same time, I would say that FSQCA has some trends in its ability to accommodate counterfactuals, for instance, counterfactuals that we know based on prior research, and even counterfactuals that we don't know. So it is not entirely unable to kind of to give you some basis to generalize to a limited degree, but not in the same way that a statistical approach does for you.
Stav, do you think the calibration of the sets maybe helps get at that a little bit?
I mean, look, what I'm thinking about is, when you're taking a variance-based approach, an econometrical approach, there are certain kind of underlying, look, if the population is distributed normally and I have a representative sample and it's also distributed, and it's representative, then, using, my, the p-values and so on, I can actually infer that based on that, the probability that my sample is some kind of a bizarre abomination and not representative, it might be very, very small, right? So I can make something like that. So then I can say, you know what, there's a really, really low chance that this is not representative of what's going on in the population, right? I can't say exactly something like that in FSQCA because it's not something that was designed to have a representative kind of analysis that you could estimate, right, how likely it is that this is just a fluke, right, rather than something that represents the population. It's not really designed for that. In fact, Krista, of course, you know this, the origin of QCA and FSQCA was to just provide a bit more kind of a way to quantifiably see patterns in qualitative data, because once you have a lot of qualitative data in a lot of cases, it is sometimes difficult to see the pattern, right? You can kind of identify the conditions, but it's kind of difficult to see how these conditions work together when you have a lot of qualitative data. And it was essentially invented to allow kind of a quantifiable visual approach to shore up patterns in qualitative data, right? So it is not intended as a statistically inferential technique to the population, but it doesn't mean that every configurational result that you see is not generalizable to the population.
Excellent. I'm going to jump to the next question, and then I'm going to add some commentary to it before I open it up, just so you're aware of what I'm going to say, because you see these questions in the Q&A too, right? So the question is pertaining to the causal condition and reverse causality issue. And the question is, does it matter in the QCA framework, given that it focuses on the sufficient condition instead of the necessary condition? If it matters, how can we rule out the reverse causality doubts if raised by reviewers? And so with that as the foundation, I'm going to reflect on the long history we have in the literature pertaining to resource advantage or resource-based view of the firm and dynamic capabilities, which have often been argued to be tautological because of the failure to be able to sort of tease out this reverse causality. And I see clear applications for the configurational approach when you're talking about combining resources to establish firm advantage. So can you kind of address the issue of reverse causality that this participant brings up? Stav or Krista?
I mean, typically we do lag, and I think they mentioned that, we do lag the causal conditions.
I would say that it's no different than the issue that we encounter with regression analysis, right? This is something that we can do design and kind of empirical stuff to try and make a strong case that it's likely that the association flows in this direction. We can use theory and prior research to explain why that is likely the case. But there is nothing really special about FSQCA that makes reverse causality more or less likely, right? It is exactly the same. Don't forget that FSQCA is, in the end, it builds conditions based on variables, right? Based on data that is collected. So all the the typical disclaimers apply, right? When was it collected? Was this collected before that? Is it possible that there are feedback loops? Maybe, right? So like all that stuff applies, and FSQCA, exactly like regression analysis, shows you that there is an association between something on the explanatory side and something on the explained side, but it won't, right? Like I said, the software doesn't know, right? The software, whatever input you give to it, it will give you the according output, which is the same with regression, right? When you tell the regression that's the DV and that's the IV, the regression doesn't know that the IV actually caused the DV and the DV did not cause the IV. And again, you can do certain things about it. And the stuff that you can do with regression analysis, you can essentially do with FSQCA as well. The lagging and showing that, whether there are feedback loops and things of that sort. And so in that sense, I would say it is essentially the same.
Okay, so you would deal with the reviewers who raise those concerns the same way with this technique as any other technique, and between theory and lagging variables, we're never going to be able to solve the issue, but we're doing contemporary approaches to address it.
Exactly.
Excellent. All right, next question before I get to some that were sent to me directly. This is the question that was put in the webinar chat. When using longitudinal data set for QCA, like the one in the ASQ article, can some variables that were peripheral conditions become more core conditions over time, or vice versa? Would that be important to look at? And if so, what would suggest that? Would you do time cuts, or kind of how would you approach that to understand the time dimension?
That's a great question. I think once if you have repeated measures, and you kind of examine the association between the causal conditions and the outcome at different points in time, right? Kind of like kind of a repeated cross-sectional analysis. If you might find not only that some peripheral conditions become core, you might find that some core become peripheral. You might find that some core that were present may be absent in a given configuration. So there is no, you don't know until you do it, right? And it is quite possible that the configurations that lead to the outcome are quite stable at different cross sections, but it might be that they are all the way to radically different and everything in between. It could be that some configurations are stable, other configurations are just, they show up 1 year, but they never show up afterwards. So maybe there was something, funky about this 1 year, and you can look into it, right? But change over time in the composition of the configurations and in the set of configurations as a whole is, I would say, almost to be expected. I mean, the nature of some, phenomena in management and in national business is such that it changes over time, and what drives it changes over time. And so that's perfectly fine. And again, there's guidance in existing publications of how you could deal with that. There are several articles that actually talk about the different ways to incorporate temporality into a configuration analysis, whether it's repeated measures or kind of like more of a process approach to it. There's a TQCA with temporal QCA, which is an approach that tries to look at the sequence in which things happen, and so on. So, the kind of the bottom line here is that we have ways to deal with the different ways in which time may affect configuration. Some of these are not perfect, but especially in the last 5 to 10 years, there have been great strides in doing this.
That's excellent. That's excellent. A lot of this reminds me of we've seen a lot of advances in methodology, and some scholars have found great success in going back in the literature and looking at major papers, seminal papers that have theorized different issues but never tested them because it wasn't really available at the time. It would seem that in the IB field, in the management field, in the marketing field, theories like configuration theory have been widely applied or argued for. And as I was mentioning, dynamic capabilities is one that obviously brings the temporal dimension, but also the combination of resource. So it would seem like this would be a technique that could really take us great strides forward in looking back at some of the seminal literature that have argued for these combinations, and then actually sort of in this configurable hypothesis post hoc proposition approach of saying, this is what people were arguing. We're kind of theory testing, but we're also sort of exploring to see, whether these relationships exist in the time period of data that we have access to. Would you agree with that sort of?
I mean, I'll give you kind of a more specific example that we mentioned in this Gibbs editorial that came out a few years ago. The OLI paradigm, which is one of the more fundamental paradigms in international business, is inherently configurational. And I think for decades, this was kind of the defining paradigm in the IB field. And we rarely, if any, actually tested whether it is kind of manifest in configurations of ownership, location, and advantage, right? A typical study would look at a specific ownership advantage, holding location and all this other stuff at its mean, right? That's how you do regressions, but that's not really how the OLI paradigm kind of works if you take it as the holistic framework that is. Location is not at its mean ever. What does that even mean, right? You have multiple ownership advantages, you have multiple locational considerations that, holding them at its mean actually takes away from how the paradigm is supposed to apply in research. So I agree with you. There is tremendous potential here to revisit seminal, foundational issues and questions, and I think we are almost guaranteed to break new ground if we do that.
Excellent, excellent. So I've got a provocative one that came in directly to me, so I'll ask it. With a grain of salt to all of us, please, because I think this is aimed at everyone. Gibbs has a reputation of putting forth editorials or invited papers that really push the field very far forward, but then when scholars try to follow them up, it doesn't seem that there's a base of reviewers who can adequately assess the paper. Comment. And I'm going to turn off my mic.
Yes, I 100% agree, both as an editor, as a reviewer, and as an author. And but I also believe that the more these editorials, the more we have webinars like this, that's going to help. I had a really positive experience, at Journal of Management, which hadn't published a lot of FSQCA papers, but had published this really positive review article about the neo-configurational approach. And that signaled to me hey, they're open. And I give the editor a lot of credit because she worked really hard to find at least one reviewer. This was a few years back. It's probably much easier now. And so as an editor, I think those of us that, and Stav's an editor too, and I know, in fact, Stav and I sometimes review for each other because we want that person that knows and understands what the authors are trying to do. So that's kind of just my take. I don't have as much editorial experience as Stav and some of the rest, but.
I agree with that. If you think that publishing FSQCA papers now is hard, imagine what it was like in 2013. Yeah, it was a lot of work, a lot of educating reviewers who have never seen it and who continue to kind of speak in econometrics language while reviewing your FSQCA paper. I think it's actually understandable if they don't know this and they're being asked, right? So I actually understand it. So I would say it takes time, change. It's very difficult to infuse a field, especially a large field with established methodological and theoretical approaches with new, especially a new technique that is just so different in its fundamental approaches. It's entrepreneurship. What we're doing here, it's a kind of entrepreneurship, right? We're bringing a new way, not necessarily better, just complementary to some of the other stuff that we are doing. I think actually it's progressing quite well, not just with FSQCA. It's we're seeing more papers with different techniques, different topics. I think that the current editorial teams at JIBS, for instance, seems to be very open to all kinds of new topics, and it's not just methodology; it's also just a phenomena like Industry 4.0. And I mean, there's like a lot of, I think, a lot of change and a lot of newness. But as we go through that process, you are going to encounter editors and reviewers who either don't get what you're doing if you're doing FSQCA, or they kind of get it, but right. Part of it also has to do with the fact that, as an editor and reviewer, what I see a lot of times is that, we're going to do FSQCA because it's new and cool, right? And we're just going to throw a bunch of conditions there and see what comes out, kind of thing. And that's kind of the primary reason, I would say, right? That going back to why would you use a configurational approach, right? I mean, I know it's new, I know it's cool, I know it's exciting, but your research question does not really warrant a configurational approach, right? And then there's other stuff like, okay, you've ran a configurational analysis, but really haven't extracted any kind of meaningful underlying theoretical patterns that change how I think about the outcome of interest or the phenomenon, right? So there's like a lot of layers to put on top of the usage of this approach that makes for a cool study. Nonetheless, I agree that we can do more to diffuse knowledge about configurational theorizing and configurational methodologies in the field, and accelerate this knowledge and acceptance of it. But we are doing it. We're doing it in conferences. We're doing the webinar. Here we are, and I think things are getting better. If you ask if we could do it faster, would I do it? Absolutely. But right, that's not always easy.
Is there anything you wanted to add? Because you look like you were writing stuff down, Krista.
Well, one thought I've had, and again, this is just me thinking, is getting this out more to practitioners. And I'm an MBA director, and I talk about my research, and I see some of these executives that I work with, the light go off when I talk about the complexity of, it's not just one thing that's going to give you competitive advantage. It's this, and talk about that idea of combinations. And so I've been thinking, I'd like to I'd like to get this more out to practitioners and for them to really, you know, they might help us in this cause in some ways, you know, at least for some of the phenomena. So that was just, I just wanted to share that thought. And I don't know if any of you have had experience, you know, working, you know, using it in more applied contexts, you know, with executive education or whatever.
Okay, so this is going to be our last question because we are running, we've got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to make this our last question. Given your experience as an author, as an editor, as a reviewer, what are the most common issues that are brought up during the review process pertaining to FSQCA that I should be aware of as an author?
I think Stav hit on those in his previous comment. Is the research question really configurational in nature? You know, why is this, and I get asked that every time I submit an FSQCA paper. Why this technique? Why, you know, why do you have to use this? And, you know, the other points that Stav made. The technical aspects of it, like Stav said, yeah, there's always that review where you got to explain the coverage and consistency to, or, you know, cite what the best practice is. Those are the easy ones. It's the justification, the motivation for using that technique.
Yeah, I would say that's a big one. I would put it in two buckets. The first bucket is kind of the technical, right? The technicalities, the best practices. Those are all out there. There have been so many editorials, that papers and primers written on it, how to calibrate, how to make all these judgment calls on the way. So it's kind of make sure that from a technical standpoint, you're on solid ground and you're applying the best practices. And then the second bucket is more so, you know, making the value of the configurational approach just very strongly apparent. And that ties to having a research question that makes the editor and the reviewer say, yeah, I don't see how we can answer this research question well without accommodating the fact that we have equifinality and complementarities and substitutions and all this kind of, right? So make a strong case that causation is complex in what you are examining. And along with that, once you have the, you know, your findings, or if you're have a priori expectations, kind of ask yourself, you know, having read this paper, would an editor or reviewer tell themselves, wow, that changes how I think about this outcome, right? So a lot of times, what I would see is that somebody has a research question that is reasonable, okay. So, you know, that they've made their case there, and then, you know, they run the configuration analysis and essentially say, well, here's what we found, you know, make the best of it, kind of thing. And so really diving back into it, trying to understand what is underpinning these, why are there complementarities, right? Why is there substitution? Why do we see this equifinality, right? What does it mean? How does it change what we currently know about this, what existing theory would say about? So really extracting these underlying patterns and implications for how we think, right? So beyond kind of the obvious, right? That's kind of, and that's more difficult than it sounds, right? Because sometimes the configurations are just, okay, you know, A plus B plus C leads to the outcome, which is, okay, I mean, we know A is good and B is good and C is good. And so, okay, so you've added a little bit in that, you know, if you only have A, probably not enough, you might need B or C, but you haven't fundamentally changed how I think about the issue.
Excellent. Wow. Just blown away. Wonderful presentation, wonderful discussion. I want to thank both of you, Krista and Stav, for just sharing your time with us and your insights. Absolutely incredible. I want to give a big shout out to our participants who came today and were so active. Great questions. Thank you all for coming. I see many people who've been to many of our presentations over the years. So wonderful to see you all back, and I hope you're enjoying it. I want to give a huge shout out to the staff at Texas A&M University and Michigan State University. We could not do these without their help. Ahmed and I barely can, kind of keep things going together anyways. And I do want to give a big shout out to my co-host, Ahmed Kurja, who's just a fabulous scholar and a wonderful person to work with on this journey. Ahmed, would you like to say a few closing words? You're muted. You're still muted.
Yeah, I was just saying the feelings are mutual. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to work with you as co-hosts here. And this was a very informative discussion. I really enjoyed this panel. And Krista and Stav, thank you for joining us today and for sharing useful insights and tips on FSQCA as a research tool in IB. And I would also like to thank our participants for joining us for this interesting panel and asking great questions. And just like David did, I would like to use this opportunity to take my co-host and colleague, friend, David, as well as our teams at MSU and Texas A&M University Cybers. And we're looking forward to seeing you again in one of our Research Spotlights webinars in the future. Thank you. Hope to see you again.
Thanks for having us.